Hello, welcome to the video. So I just want to talk a little bit about Ignatius of Antioch. This is a writing fall under the category of church father that has converted a lot of people to Catholicism. I was very fortunate that I developed and matured in my theology before I really delved into church fathers. I reached a point where I pieced together a horizontal timeline, was able to solve numerous prophecies, the dates they happened, which is extremely rare. So I really went hardcore, really pieced everything together, and that allowed me a good benchmark to go by to see discrepancies with church fathers. But anyway, so one of the things that really stood out to me right away. Okay, first of all, this is the book that I used to read, writing of Ignatius. Okay, and also for Polycarp as well. Um, And mentioned about there's a short and long version, and you go online, it mentioned that there's a short, middle, long versions. That right away is a red flag. How can people not see that's not a red flag? Um, and not only that, but there's 8 letters that are not considered credible of his writing. So that also raises a red flag. Like, how can people not see that something wrong here? We got to exercise caution and discernment. We don't just read it really quick and, oh, the word bishop's in there, and therefore we become Catholic. Um, so I like to do a little more in depth study. just just because you see the word bishop doesn't mean uh, that you should become a Catholic. Speaking of bishop, the word bishop means overseer. It was originally used for government officials. It later became a title for church leaders. I believe that happened in the 4th century when the church and state merged together. That's when the word bishop crossed over. And then now translators use the word bishop. They take that word and they superimpose it back into the scriptures, 1st century scriptures. And so they translate the Greek word that means overseer as bishop. That's how it got into the church. Okay, so the word bishop really just means overseer. And so when Paul talks about bishop, the Greek word that's used there means overseer. Don't think that just because a church does not use the word bishop does not mean that they're not following some biblical order here. They have overseers. They don't call them overseers either. They refer to them as pastors. So it's not uncommon for a pastor from the church to have another pastor overseeing. Okay. So the principle is still there. They just don't use the same labels. All right. So I think that's one thing that throws a lot of people off. But one thing that strikes me, and this is consistent throughout his writing, that I find very disturbing about Ignatius. So let's take a letter, for example, Ephesians. Yeah, Ephesians. Um, for example, it says here, obviously, anyone whom the master of the household puts in charge of domestic affairs ought to be received by us as he who had charged him with the duty. Plainly, then, we should look upon the bishop even as we would upon the Lord himself. I find that very disturbing. You don't see any of the apostles writing like that. There's no checks and balances here. It's not natural. So if you, for example, look at Paul. Now, deacon comes from the Greek word. It means server. Okay, that's all it means. So just because you have one church using the label deacon and another church using the word server, and you look at the translations here, oh, they're using the word deacons here. Therefore, this church over here is correct. They're using the word deacon. This church over here is using server. Therefore, they're not a true church. That's the mentality of a lot of Catholics. Okay? It's just ridiculous. It comes down to looking at the original language and then understanding that purpose based on the original language. But when you read this here, Paul talks about godliness, not just here. Um, so if we talk about overseer here, okay, this is properly translated first. This is how, if you have somebody who speaks English get transported in a time machine to the first century and they translate it, it would be properly translated over cedar based on just the way things were back then. Some translations have, again, bishop, but that's based on what happened in the 4th century. The church state merged together. But anyway, so he said overseer. And he talked about the qualifications here. What should you expect? Temperate, self-control, respectable, hospitable, skillful in teaching. Okay, none of this blindly. Oh, just look upon the bishop as you would upon the Lord Himself. There's no checks and balances here, and there's no way I could, in my good conscience, write like that, and just without some sort of check and balances. That's what I find so disturbing about this writing. I could not do that in my good conscience at all. Another problem that I see, now he's writing to Polycarp, okay, and so here, at the very end, it takes an odd twist. Now keep in mind he's writing to Polycarp. Now, yeah, he's saying let other churches also send to Antioch, but he's writing to Polycarp. Okay, keep that in mind. If you're writing to Sally, you don't write to Sally about Sally. You write to Sally pertinent things that are pertinent to Sally, but you don't write to Sally about Sally. Okay, and all of a sudden shift out their person. And that's the problem I have with it. Grace shall be with him forever, and with Polycarp that sends him. He's not writing Polycarp anymore. That is the red flag right there, too. So, as you can see why I have a problem, and again, this is riddled throughout his writings. So, to me, it really reeks with evidence of being modified. And I really believe it was Eusebius in the 4th century. I don't have my book with me, but his book, it's in my library upstairs. But Eusebius, he wrote a book called Ecclesiastical History. And I bought this book before I really developed mature my theology. I read little bits and pieces, but I didn't put too much weight on it. I wanted to develop my theology based on the inspired text of Scripture first. I am so glad I did, because now I put together a timeline and think things through, logistic, topography, and what was going on at the time in the history, who was emperor at the time, who was murdering people, when did Pella get burned down, and blah, blah, blah. And yet, Eusebius claimed they fled to Pella. I had to call BS on that. There's no way. That's just only one piece, okay? But I used to believe that. I used to believe Eusebius, yeah, he said they went to Pella. Well, they went to Pella. And now keep in mind, he wasn't there. He's writing from a first-person perspective. And there's a lot of writings under the category of church fathers, writings that contain a first-person perspective, writing about things that they weren't even there. You don't write from a first-person perspective about things before your time. You have to first of all credit your sources. Where are you getting this from? If I'm writing something about something 300 to 400 years ago, I am not going to write from a first-person perspective. I'm going to document my sources. This is where I got it from. I give credit to such and such. You don't see any of that. There's at least 13 of the church fathers claiming that Peter was in Rome. Okay? But anyway, this is what I find so disturbing, because that's all over the place. And so another problem here, Ignatius was a Gentile convert. That means that John could not have known Ignatius. John was the apostle of the Jews. He was focused on the house of Israel. If you go to Matthew chapter 10, verse 23, he was fulfilling that mission when he was writing the book of Revelation. He's writing to the 7 churches in Asia at the time. These were the Jews in the 7 churches who have adopted Greek culture. You're called Hellenistic Jews. You're part of the stick of Joseph. Okay, he was writing to them. So in the book of Revelation, when it talks about nations, it's talking about the Jews that's throughout the nations. In Revelation chapter 6 or 7, when it talks about the 12 tribes sealed, that's a clue right there at him being an apostle of Jews. He's writing about the Jews. Okay? So a lot of people will read the book of Revelation, they just assume that he's writing to Gentile believers in those 7 churches just because there's a lot of Gentiles there. No. That was not his mission. Paul and Barnabas, 2 apostles of Gentiles, they're the ones that are focused on the Gentiles. Okay? So the very fact that he was not Jewish suggests that the writing claiming that Ignatius knew John, it does not fit the biblical narrative at all. All right? So, I have an image where it gives you the verses and the original 12 and how it's assigned to them, and then Paul, the verses assigned to him, and you can see the distinction. Okay, now Peter did preach the gospel to the Gentile household in Acts chapter 10, but that was a one-time event. And after that, he withdrew, and she noticed in Acts chapter 10, verse 6, I believe, where the Lord said Cornelius had told Cornelius to send messenger to Peter, to reach out to Peter. That's because Peter was not going to the Gentiles. Okay, Matthew 28 verses 9, I think 18 to 20. There's what was in view there was totally the Jews to go and make disciples of all nations. That was not Gentiles. Now, Paul, on the other hand, he was going out to the Gentiles, okay? But that mission, Matthew chapter 28, had to do with the Jews. Now, there's a Greek word there that a person looked like, that, well, it must be referring to the Gentiles. No, it's actually referring to the Jews who adopted Greek culture, the Hellenistic Jews, okay, that were spread out to all nations, okay? Acts chapter 2, verse 5. There were Jews in every nation. Okay, so bottom line is there's no way Ignatius would have known John. Okay, it did not fit the mission that John was given. It did not fit the biblical narrative. Okay, and I hope that when you watch my video, you will see that I am fairly detail oriented, unlike a lot of believers. And I hope that you will be too. That you pay attention to detail. It's just unfortunately lacking amongst a lot of believers. But anyway, there are other passages where Paul talks about an overseer and godliness. There's checks and balances in his writings. With Ignatius, there's none of that. So I believe what happened was that, in a very strong, compelling theory in my mind, is that Eusebius modified the writing of Ignatius. Eusebius himself was a bishop or overseer. He was a spiritual advisor to Constantine, where the church and state merged together. That was the first, I believe, I think it was somebody actually before him that was spiritual advisor to the emperor. I believe that's where it all began, the church state mixing together. And then I think he was the second spiritual advisor to the emperor, and Constantine was emperor at the time. But anyway, I believe what happened, he was considered a heretic, and he was trying to overcome that, regain power. So what he did was he tried to rewrite history, which was, again, not that difficult to do in the 4th century. We being in the 21st century, we have a mindset that there are thousands of copies of everything all throughout history of books. That's just not the case. In the 4th century, they had scrolls, they used papyrus. They did not have printing presses, they did not have internet. And so they only had 28 libraries throughout the entire Roman Empire. The lower class did not own any scrolls or books. The church and state was all burning at the time, the scroll burnings. And so when you piece it together, it was not that difficult for Eusebius to rewrite church history. And I know that's hard for a person to grasp, but the more you study it, the more you see, okay, wow, it was not that difficult back then, unlike today. Okay. So anyway, I believe that Ignatius is probably one of the first writings that Eusebius modified. It's where we see a lot of mistakes were made, a lot of unnaturalness. The mistakes they make in the other modifications to church fathers. Um, he's writing from a right as if it's a first person perspective, as if they were there and they weren't. And so that's one of the consistent things. But how I'm able to see this sort of stuff is by carefully piecing together a timeline, knowing things when things were fulfilled. Um, it really helped. So when they go and say, well, John was here until the time of Trajan, who started his reign in the year 98, uh, that was not possible. John was not around then. That would make Jesus a false prophet. So anyway, on it goes. But now you get an idea why I have such a problem with Ignatius. It's highly problematic. I mean, I'm only scratching the surface. This is all over his writing, this sort of behavior. And again, he's writing to Polycarp, all said about Polycarp. It's just not, and then the fact he was a Gentile, he could not have known John. To claim that he knew John. Now, why would somebody make that up? Is to make it look like there's this perfect succession of beliefs, positive succession, we call it, that passed on. So by making it look like John was older and making it look like these people knew John, then they can get away with this idea of succession beliefs. But if you know the real mission given to the original 12 versus Paul and Barnabas, you see that it just was not possible. When Jesus said, you will not make it or finish going through the city of Israel, come, what does that tell you? They were busy the entire time knowing that they were not going to make it, but they're going to try to get as much as cover they could. And then, of course, Paul, Barnabas come to the scene, and there are other Jews who basically, between all of them, were able to fulfill Colossians chapter 1, verse 23, where the gospel had been preached to every creature under heaven. And how would Paul know that? He would have had to meet up with others who were doing the same thing, preaching the gospel, and knowing what a territory they covered, where they do that in Jerusalem, where the temple was the center of theocracy for the Jews. And so it was not in Rome. Okay. So anyway, yeah. So hopefully you can see why I have such a problem with Ignatius of Antioch. I mean, anybody who exercised discernment, used common sense, who had a decent amount of hermeneutics, who detail-oriented, carefully pieced together a timeline, understands chronology, will see that there's a lot of problems with this. And that's why a lot of people who allow themselves to convert to Catholicism or Orthodox, whatever, they're not very good in hermeneutics, discerning, being detail-oriented, don't really know the biblical timeline. They don't have a benchmark truth to go by. They actually use church fathers to benchmark truth. Once you do that, you're just flooding your mind presuppositions, which naturally lead to eisegesis of the scriptures. And so, yeah, and good luck getting out of that. All right, well, thank you very much for watching, and hope you have a great day.